Oh, I know, you really, and that's so, such a different piece. I can't picture what frame would make it work.
Are they marching one by one?
I think we're all here.
What I would see more.
Yeah. All right. Let's begin. Well, welcome everybody. We're going to start with a roll call, and then I have some introductory remarks, then we'll take public comments. So if you'll do a roll call, please, Mr. Vega.
So roll call for the Public Arts Committee special meeting. Commissioner Tosher? Here. Commissioner Addison? Here. And Chair Golden?
Here. Okay, fabulous. I believe there are additional materials for the meeting over at the end of the table. If anybody wants to pick up and follow along that way, feel free. Oh, I want to welcome everybody, and I appreciate that the members of the museum board and the museum director and Mr. Conrad are here, as well as our artist, Mr. Lochner. I think we have some questions for you, and we'll get to that. Our purpose in this meeting is to recommend to City Council whether or not a budget increase of $8,000 to $10,000 from the Capital Improvement Fund is warranted for the Museum Gates Public Art Project. That project was approved at the joint meeting in May between the Historical Preservation Committee and the Committee to Approve Public Art, and it was approved for the amount of $20,000. I want to note that at that joint meeting, we did not include the consideration of a budget increase. That was not on our agenda. That is a contractual issue and normally settled way in advance of the stage at which we are at this point. I also want to note that a letter received by City Council in early June from the Museum Board supporting the artist's request for additional funding prompted City Council to direct the Arts Commission's public art body to take a lead role in all gate matters, and so this has come before us. So once again, the situation now is to consider the merits and justification of the proposed increase so that we can make a fair recommendation through the Arts Commission back to City Council. And with that, I'll ask if there are any public comments. Please come up. We're on tape. This is being taped. And we want you to use the microphone. You might have to adjust it, but please come up to the podium when you're ready to offer us any public comments.
You want to start with public comment?
Yes, we always, it's if you look at the agenda, it follows roll call. Thank you.
Wendy Barker, Museum Director, Ojai Valley Museum. This is a project that started before I was hired at the museum. But in my previous job, I worked at a museum for almost 17 years that had a blacksmith shop. So I know a lot of ironworkers. I know a lot of people who build gates and things like this. It was a working shop. We taught blacksmithing, so I know both professionals and a lot of semi-professionals. The initial gates that were designed by Doug, which would have come in at the correct budget that had been approved, we really liked, the museum really liked. They were a simpler design, less materials, less work to make. And for me personally, I absolutely feel that the new designs that were prompted by the Historic Preservation Commission warrant the additional money. It's a lot more materials, and the materials themselves are very costly, and it's a lot more intricate designs. To me, it's worth it. This is a beautiful building downtown that's landmarked, that is almost 100 years old. It's 99 years old. It's going to be around for at least another 99 years. And so are these gates. These gates are designed to last for very, very, very long time. And so while it seems like a pretty big jump in budget now in the long run, it's not to me in the scheme of things. So I encourage you to encourage City Council to increase the budget. Thank you.
Before you sit down, Wendy, no, you know what? We'll do questions as we go along. We'll take public comments first. I'm changing my mind. Thank you very much for your comments. If you state your name for the record.
Hi, I'm Roger Conrad. I've been a volunteer with the museum since 1999, and I've since later become a staff member there, so you can be clear on that. I want to talk about kind of the history, having been there for 18 years. And we have a similar condition in the back of the museum to what we have in the front of the museum. Basically, there's a parking lot in the back, and there's kind of a horseshoe-shaped patio. And one of the problems that we had for years was that was an ideal spot for homeless people to set up camp and sleep. And so I'd come in the morning, and I'd find people in there, or a lot of times I'd just find the residue of sleeping bags, blankets, clothing, all things like that, sometimes even human feces that we had to clean up. And a few years ago, in order to have children's events in the back of the museum, we put in a gate, and the museum paid for that particular gate. We were originally going to lock it, and we ran into a condition with the fire department about having a Knox locking situation, and so that was another issue. So we've left it unlocked. And one of the things that I've heard were discussions before that people could easily just climb over the fence. And in the back, you can easily climb over the fence and get into it. But since we've had the gates up, we've had absolutely no homeless people back there, and it's been a much better condition. In the front, I've had similar things happening. We've had artwork destroyed, which basically homeless people would camp in the front because there's some nice little private places to go. And one night I was working late in the gallery putting up a show, and all of a sudden I heard a lot of commotion outside, so I went out by the visitors center, and there was about 8 to 10 young people having a great time drinking and everything, and one of them was up on our condor. Mm-hmm. And he was just about ready to put his foot on the head of the condor and put some weight on it. And I managed to catch them and disperse them out of that particular location. But that's supposedly a hazard because we do wax the condor once a year, so somebody could fall off it if they were climbing it. So I think by having it unlocked, it basically invites people into that area. A lot of times I'll find people in there that are simply enjoying themselves walking through this historic building. And of course, not all the people are destructive, and it's a shame that we have to create some kind of security there for that. But so those are the two reasons that I think first it would be sufficient just to have gates there that would keep people out of it. And that would allow us to do more outdoor activities and not have to worry quite as much about things being vandalized or having to clean up after the homeless. So, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Roger. I appreciate your comments. Anyone else from the audience that wants to make a comment before we move on? Okay, no. All right, well, I'm going to once again emphasize that this, in a way, is a meeting to find facts and to try to unravel what happened, the order in which it happened, and what kind of agreement, if any, was made by the museum and the artist. And I'd like to start with Marcy Toscher, who sits on the Public Art Committee. Oh, yes, for clarification, the three of us sit on the Committee to Approve Public Art, and the Committee to Approve Public Art does an approval of an art project that it has engineered. But once the project is approved, anything relating to contract is handled by the Public Art Committee, the three majority members of the Committee to Approve Public Art. So that's why you're with us today, because this is the normal procedure that we would follow. So I want to start with a member of the Public Art Committee who's also a member of the Committee to Approve Public Art, Marcy Toscher. And I think Marcy has prepared some questions, I think.
Yeah.
So we'll let her go first.
Okay.
And you can pull your mic over and make sure it's on, Marcy.
I think it is. Yeah.
You're going to poke that little button and make light of, there you go.
Okay. So, as Christine mentioned, City Council has referred this matter to us to do a little due diligence and find out whether or not we want to recommend that the city dip into its coffers to pay the increase in the budget from 20,000 to 30,000 if we do certain finishes. Anyway, this wound up in our laps in a really unorthodox way. And for whatever the reasons, it's kind of irrelevant. Now we have to deal with it, and we have to try to reconstruct and figure out what a contract, if it originally existed, would have said, what things were said to people orally, what are our obligations, things like that. And ideally, a public art jury would have been called to handle this from the outset, in which case we would have promulgated an RFP, and we would have gone through different procedures, and the RFP would have included a detailed budget that we would have also been privy to. So today we sit here, we don't have any documents to look at, we're relying on what people are saying happened and what things were said. So just in the spirit of fact-finding, as Christine mentioned, I just have a few questions, probably for you, Mr. Lochner, and maybe for you too, Wendy, since you have familiarity with blacksmithing and all of that. So, I'd like an education in this. So when I looked at the two different designs, the original design that was rejected by the Historic Preservation Committee and the design that the HPC and Kappa has approved, I'm not quite sure I understand in terms of difficulty of fabrication and time, the amount of time, because from my experience with like construction and things like that, I know whenever you get into curves, circular things, it gets more expensive. And so when I look at the original design, to me, it's kind of a complicated curvilinear design that has to meet just so, and I'm not sure those single pieces of tubes, do you have any soldering going on here or whatever? Because
well, there's no soldering, it's all welded. So the initial design is all, except for the scrolls,
right.
The rest of it's cold forged. So it doesn't require any heat. It's all done with a power hammer to take solid rod and texture it, and then I run it through rollers to do the bending.
Okay.
So there's, compared to the gate, the subsequent gate, which came about due to restrictions placed on us by the Historic Preservation Committee, it's massively less work. The gate that was approved is going to be weeks in front of a forge, hand forging all those elements. Every single post on the gate that is approved is hand bent and textured and tapered and forged, as compared to taking a piece of metal that's 20 feet long and running it through a set of rollers to get the curve of the original gate.
Yeah, it looks like you have to be really precise with how these things match up, and the curves have to be
But that's all done with equipment.
How many hours would you say it would take to fabricate the original gates versus the approved design?
The approved design is probably at least four times the amount of time
that the original gates were. And in terms of materials, how can you describe the different types of materials that will be used now versus the original design?
Well, the original design was all based on a single half-inch square bar. The design that's been approved now has multiple different materials in different component sizes, all of which are hot forged by hand. There's plate steel, there's stainless steel, there's a variety of different rods and stocks, and there's hand forged rivets and things like that. I mean, there's tube steel. It's they're not even close to comparable.
Okay. Could you give me an estimation as to the cost of materials for the original design versus the approved design?
I don't have that with me at the moment.
off the top of your head? Did you do a materials list for both of the
Yeah, I
gates?
do a material list on everything I do,
So,
but
Do you recall-
I don't have that information in front of me. But, you know, that's not how this thing came about. The original design was done purposely to fit a budget,
right, I understand that.
and it didn't fit that budget.
You were over at that point.
Oh, yeah, I was at least 10,000 over, but I was willing to do it for that budget,
Did you
okay?
communicate that to
Oh, yeah,
anyone?
they are fully aware of that. So,
And was anything agreed to
meaning,
on the other side, the museum or anyone? Did they?
I told them I would do the gates for 20 grand. I mean, that's what was agreed.
But
to.
as you realized, as the cost.
I didn't
of-
ask for more money on the original gates.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't until the HPC came along and said that those weren't acceptable, and then that they wanted all this other stuff,
Mm-hmm.
and it got immensely more complicated,
Mm-hmm.
that the budget changed. And that change wasn't driven by me. That was driven by the fact that you've got something that's immensely more complicated
Did
in
you ad-
every facet.
Right. Did you advise the HPC that now you were getting into overage?
If you
Territory?
go back and look at that meeting, I advised them that the gates that they didn't approve were designed in that way to fulfill that budget, and what they were asking for would far exceed that budget.
Did anyone from the HPC indicate that they weren't concerned about that, or
They didn't seem to care.
they didn't seem to care?
No, it seems to me that nobody seems to care the amount of time and effort that I put into this in trying to achieve something that I was brought in to do 3 years ago.
Right. Oh, no, we're not questioning that. The gates will be incredible, and we're lucky to have you contribute to, beautiful projects in Ojai. It has nothing to do with that. We're just trying to do due diligence
Right.
to ascertain that
Un-
these charges are justified so
Un-
that the city can dip in and
Sure.
pull the money out.
Unfortunately, because of the driving factors with the front gates, with both the gates, but certainly the front gates, having to do with the wall and the archway and the fact that we can't touch any of that, it immensely complicates the way you approach this. So that in itself creates a level of difficulty that, forget the gates, right? Just the framework, you're probably talking 10 grand.
But
Just for that, right?
Right.
And that's just for one gate.
Right. But the framework, you haven't had to re-engineer.
The framework's different on the second gate than it was on the first gate.
So is it re-engineered then? All of
Yes.
it is re-engineered in a more costly way
It's
to attach
it's-
everything
it's
and,
way different. The original gates had 2 posts. This gate has a full arch and a
right?
grade beam,
Right.
and it's a totally different animal.
So you spent more time re-engineering
Oh,
the new
absolutely.
gates? Okay.
And the way it's installed, I believe it's better than the original design because it's in the center of that archway. So the original design was at the back of the archway, so it was actually behind the archway on 2 posts, which I had come up with a pivot gate so that you didn't see the hinges. The gates were actually sitting on post, which created the hinge.
Right.
But there was no arch. There was none of the corresponding structure that these gates have.
Right.
So there's not the intricacy of trying to create an arch inside that masonry arch that optically is perfect, because that's not perfect.
No.
If you go in and measure that, it's
Oh,
not.
I'm sure everything's settled out and,
Well, and it's just, it's handmade, so the curve's not perfect. So that means that we can't just take a machine and do a 12-foot radius and have it fit.
Right,
Right? It's got to
right.
be done, we have to make a template and then bend that tube that creates the arch,
Right.
that creates the structure, so that you can have the side posts not come in over time. has to be all done by hand.
Right.
And that's just an insanely
Yeah.
complex,
Well, see, the bending and the arch,
time-consuming
that, yeah.
process.
The bending and the arch is what I was thinking about in terms of the original gate
But
designs.
those gates, the bends and the arches are done with equipment, with bending equipment, because we don't have to conform to something that's not
Okay.
even, right?
Okay,
So it's different. So I'm
Right.
bending I'm bending things that are mathematically the same. Everything's linear. So I don't have to adjust. So when
Okay.
I bend the layers of that
Right,
gate,
right.
they're just fractions of each other.
Okay,
Right?
okay.
So you take the rollers on the machine, because it's done on a 3-pinch roller, and you adjust them to give you those corresponding bends.
Okay,
So it's relatively, it's an easier thing to get to. There's still, I mean, it's a lot of work. It's not like you just press a
No,
button and it
right.
happens, but it's nowhere near the complexity of the other gate, because
Right.
the other gate we're actually conforming to something that's not square,
Right.
not plumb,
Right.
not level,
Right.
and not round.
right. This is quite an education.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, I get it.
So
I get it.
it's like a weird, ultimately, it's a better gate, I think, for a lot of reasons. But it's an enormously different project than sticking 2 posts in the ground, me building 2 gates,
Mm-hmm.
where I don't have to worry about the opening, anything about it other
Right.
than its relative size.
Right,
Literally setting them down over the post and
Right.
walking away.
Right,
This
right.
isn't that animal. This
Right.
is the first thing we do is we come out and literally make a template,
Mm-hmm.
a steel template that's exact to that wall,
Right.
to the brick.
right. Right, okay, great, thank you.
Do you know what I mean? So that
I
alone is half a
understand.
day's work,
I understand, yeah.
and then everything's built off that.
Right, no, so that's key, time consuming. I asked about the engineering, the weights of the gate, are they any different, are they similar? The weights of the approved gates versus the original design?
Well, the approved gates are larger, and so they weigh more.
Oh, who paid for the historical resources
The
survey?
museum
The
did.
museum
You guys did? Okay.
It's in the materials.
Okay, those
That's
were
it,
my
Marissa?
questions, yeah, thank you.
Michael, do you have any follow-up questions, or do you want to just go?
I'd like to move on to another subject, actually.
Okay,
and
great.
that's the contract discussion, and I guess this is something I'll have to talk with Wendy about, but also perhaps Doug. Could you tell me what was covered in the initial discussion when, I'm sorry, I thought it was the contract discussion. Could you tell me what was covered in the initial discussion when the project was presented to Doug? Was he told an amount of money at that time? Was he told that it would be $20,000?
Yes. Now, when it first
Well, actually, no.
started, I wasn't even hired. So,
It
Okay.
started with Michelle,
All right, well
and
then,
she came to me and said, we need security gates because we're having these issues.
right?
And, you know, there's this sensitivity with the walls, et cetera, et cetera. Can you figure out how to do this affordably?
And was a dollar amount mentioned at
No.
that point?
And I came back to them, so I came up with a few different scenarios, showed the museum. They picked one, and I said, well, you're looking at, I can do that or I will do that for 20 grand.
So you initially raised the figure of $20,000?
The 20,000 was what I was willing to take to do the initial 2 gates.
Okay, so that was your figure that you
That was my
presented.
figure. It wasn't a budget. I gave them the budget.
Okay.
And that was basically with
Doesn't
me
match the
donating to them, time and materials to fit with that, because they don't have a lot of money. You know, they're
I understand that.
for
I'm
every
just trying to
penny.
get a clear understanding of how it was determined, the
Right.
$20,000.
So I came up with that number.
Okay, and the museum agreed to that, and they proposed then to the city council,
Who
and-
funded that?
Who funded that to the tune of $20,000, correct?
Yes.
For that gate,
I understand that.
right.
Now, when it went to HPC and a new design was proposed, or required, more appropriately, what were the discussions between the museum and the artist regarding the new designs and the $20,000 figure? Was that subject discussed?
It was, and I just kept saying, we got $20,000. We don't have
Right.
more. And Doug was saying it's going to cost more.
Yeah, you can't, I told them, as I told the committee in those meetings, you can't get what you want for that budget. It just can't be done. Even at this budget, I'm still donating over 10 grand, you know what I mean? So it's,
But it was made clear to you from the beginning and to this point that there was $20,000, and you made it clear to the museum that the project couldn't be done for $20,000. Is that accurate?
no, the original budget of 20,000 was specific to the original gates.
Precisely.
Okay,
But
as soon as
when-
the original gates were thrown out the window, that number was thrown out the window. Because
Okay.
that number was attached to the original
I
gates.
understand that. What I'm trying to get
So-
at is what happened following that? When you all got together again then after that HBC meeting, did the museum say, we'll go for more money? Or did the museum say, we only have $20,000? And I guess that's a question to you, Wendy.
I think we didn't specifically say that. I mean, Doug and I had a number of conversations, mostly over the phone, and I kept saying, we only got 20 grand, and he's like, well, you're gonna need more. So we weren't sure, and we didn't see the actual final budget until the day that it went to Kappa and HBC, that joint meeting, and I was on my way to the airport.
Right.
We knew that we might have to try to come up with more money, and we weren't sure where we were gonna come up with that.
Okay, so that was
So
clear.
we knew that,
We were more concerned with getting something approved.
but we didn't know how much it was
And
gonna
then figuring out
increase.
what it was gonna cost and how to pay for it, than trying to, shoehorn something into that 20 grand, because it's 20 grand in a way was an arbitrary number to begin with, because it was based on something that wasn't relevant anymore, right?
But it wasn't arbitrary in the sense that you're a professional, as you said, you'd done cost estimates, and you knew that you could do it within $20,000.
The first
allowing for-
gate.
Yeah, the first gates, I recognize that.
Right.
Now, let me ask another question then. Why did you shift to the much more time-consuming and material choice that you made for the second set of gates?
Because of HPC.
Because of their
Because of
direction.
what they wanted. This is explicitly per, what I did was I took my notes from that meeting.
Yeah?
And designed a set of gates per what they were asking for.
In what way were they asking for the, I
And-
mean, I know that they asked for certain design elements, but they didn't dictate the choice of materials, did they?
Well, it's still, forged steel and stuff. I mean, it's basically
Right.
more in line with what they were looking for, in that it's more toward a traditional gate versus, the other gate's modern.
No, that's an aesthetic issue, that we're not
Well,
talking
it's-
about
but
that.
it's an aesthetic that boils back down to the way it's made.
I'm afraid you've lost me. I don't understand still why you shifted to a different process for the metal.
Because the process that I proposed, they rejected.
No, they rejected a design, they didn't reject the process.
The design is driven by the process.
Okay, then maybe I should reframe it then. Why did you choose a design motif for the second set of dates that depended upon a more expensive process? Why didn't you?
Because they dictated that process. They wanted hand-forged gates. They wanted gates that met with the mission.
I see.
Revival style, that
Okay.
were, they showed us pictures.
Yeah, I
that
mean,
were-
they really talked about specific things that they thought it should look like. They mentioned other gates in town. They wanted something very traditional, and the second design uses traditional methods.
All right. And when Doug presented the second design to you and said it would be 30,000 instead of 20,000,
We didn't see the figure at first. The board saw the design without a figure attached and approved the design concept.
so the board then approved it on the presumption that it would be within the same price range? Were they told it was going to be more expensive?
They knew that it would likely be more, but they didn't know how much more.
When I designed the gates, I designed them to fulfill the requirements that were placed on us by HPC.
Right.
I didn't design to a budget. So prior to working out all the details of how to build it, all the nuances of cost and things like that, we wanted to see if it would even get approved, right? So the first step in getting it approved was to have the museum board approve it,
Okay.
which they did. And then the second step was to have HPC approve it.
Well,
So-
and I want to interject too, when the board saw it, I don't think it was the final, I think he was still tweaking a little
Right.
bit. You know, he wanted to show us, the board, is this,
Will this fit?
will this fit with what you want before I complete all the drawings and all of the final things? Because we felt like we're on a time budget, you know, we've been told by our insurance company we're supposed to have gates, and it's several years down the
Sure,
road, and
sure.
we know that we have to go through all these different commissions and approvals, so we're, you know, and the board only meets once a month, and different commissions meet different times, and you gotta get the paperwork in, so we were trying to expedite it.
So the board then approved a incomplete design.
I would say it wasn't
complete.
incomplete, but it wasn't completely fleshed out, I guess is
Well,
how
it
I
was
would say.
complete, it just wasn't to the extent that was submitted to you guys. You know, I went back and cleaned up the renderings and things like that, but graphically, it was extensively what you have.
Yeah, and there was some, I think even a little bit of options in that, right?
I had given them some options, you know, with and without that kicker plate on the bottom, things
Yeah,
like
yeah.
that. So they chose the kicker plate option, which is what you guys finally approved. So, you know,
Maybe the question needs to be addressed to Mark Lewis then, who's the chairman of the board. When the board approved the design as presented at that point, was there any discussion of cost?
Wait, Mark, will you come up to the microphone, because we are on video? Thank you, Mark, appreciate it.
No, we considered the new design. The subject of cost, I think, was raised informally. We did not go forward with that discussion. We were thinking of it as, we knew what the city's budget was. We suspected it might be a different number, but we did not consider that. We just considered the design.
Okay.
We didn't consider a different budget. We didn't consider raising, lowering the budget. We looked at the new design and considered and then approved the design without any budget attached.
Right.
Apart from the fact that the budget ongoing was 20,000.
20,000.
and at that meeting, they were told, when I presented it to the board, that it would cost more money, that this far exceeded the original budget,
Informally, yes. In other words, no dollar attached to that.
because I
Okay.
hadn't come up with a dollar yet.
All right. Okay, so I guess that answers my question, and then on that subject, yeah, okay. So the board approved it, not knowing what it would cost, and it
Approve
was,
the design.
approved the design,
right.
yes, to submit and to move forward, not knowing what the final cost would be. Correct? Okay,
Correct.
that's all I have.
I mean,
All right,
originally, these weren't public art gates, these were security.
I understand that, but
Yeah.
that's history,
Well,
that's history, that's
and I'd like to
immaterial.
start with that, really, because, and if you don't have a copy of, I've put together a timeline on what happened with this gate project, and I think it's important that we all take a look at that timeline, because there've been some things here that don't match the timeline, and if I need to correct it, I'm more than willing to do that. But in April of 2015, I believe, or so, the materials suggest that the museum, would not have been you, Wendy, it would have been your predecessor, Michelle, contacted Doug, Mr. Lochner, regarding security gates. They were not called art gates at the time, for both the main entrance and the side entrance. Then on April 30th of 2015, Mr. Lochner reported back to the museum board on, you've said this, several proposed designs and installation aspects of both of the gates. On May 25th, 2015, you reached a memorandum of understanding with the museum regarding intellectual property rights, correct? On June 13th, this is a month later, 2015, and I watched the entire meeting, so on this I'm pretty certain of what I'm saying. The museum came, several of you came, and petitioned City Council for $10,000. It was Mr. Wyrick, Councilperson Wyrick, who said, let's up it to $20,000. We'd like you to hire an artist, and we'd like these to be a public art gate project. That's what happened. That's where the $20,000 came from. It was actually came from Mr. Wyrick. And the money was approved by City Council out of the Capital Improvement Project Fund, and that's important also to note. At that point, and this is really not important, the project never did appear before the Public Art Committee. It somehow landed on the desk of CDD, and that's just a whole other story, not important to get into. But that's the reason why now we sit here, I think. On July 1st, 2015, that is when the museum informed the artist that $20,000 was approved by the City Council to fund the gate project. Now we're going to move forward to 2016. A few months later, the Community Development Department received the initial gate design packet from the artist. And they immediately knew that the building had historical significance. So the museum gate project at that point was referred to the Historical Preservation Commission, and a historic resource survey was sought, which the museum paid for. And that was completed October 28th, 2016. Now we're going to fast forward quite some time. And we happen to know why this happened, and there was this gap in months, almost a year, when nothing was done with the gates. And that's because Mr. Lochner was very, very busy, thank you very much, doing the project at Libby Park Playground. And so there was a delay, and that was the reason for that delay. Then, after that was finished, in January 12th of 2017, the Historical Preservation, this year, the Historical Preservation Commission reviewed and rejected Mr. Lochner's initial gates design for the reason that they did not, in their opinion, fit into the correct style of the building. On May 8th, the Community Development Department received a redesign for both the front and the side gates from Mr. Lochner. And in that presentation packet, the artist noted that 100 hours were invested in the design and in the redesign process. So that was already right there. Then, shortly thereafter, May 11th of this year, a joint meeting was held between the Historical Preservation Committee and the Committee to Approve Public Art. We reviewed the redesign of the gates, and we recommended that approval to the Art Commission. At that meeting, and I was the one who said it, we noted that the project amount allocated by City Council was $20,000, and that we had no authority, nor was it agendized for us to discuss or consider an increase in the budget. Then on May 18th, the Art Commission approved CAPA's recommendation and again noted that it was for the $20,000. We thought things were hunky-dory and all ready to move forward. On June 1st, however, so this is following the joint meeting, June 1st of this year, Mr. Lewis sent a letter to the city manager supporting the artist's request for additional funding for $8,000. They said that they didn't find the powder coating necessary, so they were going for the $8,000 for the two gates. Then on June 13th, that came before City Council at a public meeting, a regular City Council meeting, and City Council said this request needs to go back to the public art arm of the Arts Commission. It's a public art project. That's how it landed here. So on July 28th, we requested a report from Mr. Lochner to detail the proposed revised budget for the gate so that we could begin to consider it. And we saw that there would be a need to have a public meeting for this matter because it is so incredibly complicated. So I just wanted to review what happened and how we got here to date. And then I have some comments and some questions as well. And some of this may be a little repetitive because I had no idea what my
So-
fellow...
You said to correct you if you were wrong.
Oh, please do.
There's one thing.
Yes.
My original proposal back to them for budgeting was 10,000 per gate. So there were 2 gates.
And that was back in April of 2015?
Right.
Okay.
So there were
Was that before or after City Council had approved the money, Doug?
before.
Before, okay.
So it was 10,000 per gate. There were 2 gates, and what I was doing was, looking them as a total budget, not, because really one gate costs more than the other. You know what I mean? They weren't of equal stature and money, but.
Got it.
So, but anyway, the original discussions we had was 10,000 per gate.
So it was a little bit of serendipity that the City Council came up with the figure of 20,000?
I don't think I was at that meeting, right?
No, that was a regular City Council meeting.
Yeah, so I have
So that was
no,
just serendipitous.
No,
Yeah, kind of sweet.
And-
I like it.
Just one note, I do believe what your timeline states is accurate. There may be some issues, but I believe the actual request to council was for $10,000 from the museum.
Yes, that's
I'm
what
not
we-
saying that your proposal
no, so
wasn't
that
more,
might
but-
have been.
Yes, and that is
wired
noted there.
somewhere along the line, I don't know.
Yeah. And that at this point probably is just good as a background to the questions I'm going to
Sure.
ask and the remarks that I'm going
I
to
mean,
make.
the
so that we're-
original proposal couldn't be done for $10,000.
Okay, gotcha. Okay, and I want to say, before I ask questions and I make my remarks, that this in no way, I hope it doesn't come across like you're sitting here before, the FBI or the CIA and we're putting you on the spot. We are really struggling to understand how this all came about and what was said to the artist and whether or not anything could be considered a contract that we really should consider when we decide, the 3 of us, how to recommend to the Arts Commission this matter. So I apologize ahead of time because I tend to get emotional, as most of you know, and please forgive me now while I take a little breath. Because I need to do that. I drink a water. So the questions are really to get information. One of the things I've done since I knew that this meeting was occurring was to very carefully sit the 2 documents, the HPC packet and the joint meeting packet, side by side and to go through them to see what exactly were the modifications and additions to the original proposal. And I've identified that obviously there were new gate drawings and a thicker plate at the bottom, modification of the side gate from 4 panels to 3. In the packet, numerical markers were added to cite photographs that support the narrative that details how the new design would complicate historic museum design features and elements. And 2 new descriptive paragraphs were added in the design section of the narrative. That really is the breadth of what changed in the packets. I'm only referring here to the packets. However, in that joint meeting packet, the artist, Mr. Lochner, also included a narrative outline of what project steps had already been completed to date. He added a list of additional work required for completion of the project, and there is where he also put in his proposed revised budget, and all of that you can find in your attachment A. So the primary question in my mind is whether or not the redesign justifies recommending to City Council an additional $8,000 from the Capital Improvement Fund. Now, in his revised budget, the artist says the new gates will require additional material and fabrication costs, and Marcy did a really fabulous job of getting some more specificity about that. But my question really is that prior to agreeing to do a design that requires additional material and additional labor, it would seem that there would be an agreement reached between the artist that was very clearly laying out that this was going to be almost 50% more in cost than the original designated budget, and how in turn that would and could be funded. So, this has kind of been asked, but I want to go back and I want to make sure we really understand this. Did the artist advise, and this is a museum question, so either Mark or Wendy could answer this. Did the artist, I would really like the answer from one of the two of you. Did the artist advise the museum that a redesign would require additional funds prior to agreeing to do that more expensive redesign? Yes? No?
He told me that based on what the HPC was asking for, it was going to cost more money.
Okay.
And I said, we only have $20,000, and he said, it's going to cost more. And so we needed the gates. And I'd been told by my board, I need to move this forward. So it's like, okay, we'll design them and we will figure out how we're going to pay for it.
All right, and that leads to my second question, which is really not a question as much as it is a supposition based on what you've said. You then did not project that, oh, the city will give us more money for this. In your mind, it was, oh, we're going to have to figure out a way to get more money for this?
And that was an option. In my mind, that was.
It was an option.
An option,
Okay.
and, but,
Understand.
with our financial situation, that was
Right.
the best option for us as a relatively small nonprofit. And at that point, I wasn't sure how much more it was going to be either.
Okay.
And ultimately, it's city property.
Oh, it is city, that's why it's a city project, because it's city property. Now, I know from a conversation that I've had with Mark, with Mr. Lewis, the board president, museum board president, that the funding increase was not approved by the board prior to the joint meeting. So the design, the more expensive design was done, but, and it was presented at the joint meeting, but all that happened prior to your sending a letter asking for additional money.
Correct.
Okay.
Right, so the joint meeting, we got the updated budget right before that dual meeting, and the board didn't meet for, what was the date of that? They meet the end of the month. I think it was a couple weeks later.
Well, the letter from Mr. Lewis went to.
No, when did Kappa and HPC meet together?
Oh, that was May 11th.
May 11th. So the board doesn't meet till the last Wednesday of the month. So they hadn't seen it, but
Did they see it at that last meeting of the month?
at the end of May. They saw it at
They
the
saw
end.
it at the end of the May. So the
the end of
board
May.
did see it at the end of May, so that
Yeah, but
leads
it
to a
had already been
question.
approved.
But did the board approve that? Because there was an amount now. Did the board approve it at that meeting?
Yes.
Mark? Is shaking his head and Wendy is saying yes.
Yes, we approved.
Would you come on up, please? We need to have you up here.
The board essentially decided to see if the city would pick up the extra $8,000.
So the board approved going forward and asking city council for more money?
Yes.
Okay. Did you communicate to Douglas that, that this budget, that you were going to find money for this and that he could proceed?
Did the board? No.
No.
Well, we haven't proceeded. We're on.
Right. Well, I just want to know if there was then a phone call or a conversation
No.
with Douglas to the effect of, we're going to get the money, start working. But no,
No.
that didn't happen.
No.
Was there any communication with Mr. Lochner that you were sending a letter to city council? Did he know that you were going to advocate for him?
At the meeting, we did decide. I'm sure we communicated that to Doug. I don't recall specifically.
So he was under, it seems to me, that he was under the, or he was assuming that you, as the board president, or your board, the museum board, was going to do what it could to increase the funding for this project.
At that point,
In good
certainly.
faith, he believed that. Is that correct?
At that point, yes.
Okay, good.
We had not addressed any
I think
number.
that's really important. We want to
I
know,
still believe that.
he still believes that.
One way or another, we'll get.
As Studs Terkel said, hope dies last.
Yeah, so.
You all know who Studs is, right?
I think the the thing here, the main thing to realize is when we came back.
On over here, yeah.
When we came back for the second go-round, we were far more concerned with appeasing HPC and Kappa than we were about dollars and cents.
Right.
You know what I mean? We were trying to get this thing in to make everybody happy, which, as you know, is often difficult, especially when
Well,
you
it
have-
certainly does seem so now.
So, you know, we had committees at cross purposes, and
Yes,
you know, this gate, I think, is what was approved is a good compromise in the sense that it achieves everybody's goals on both sides, the historic people, the art people, you know, it brings all that together. Unfortunately, it costs more.
Right.
But that's it's sort of a sad reality in life. You know, it's like when you go out and it's like the difference between, you know, a Prius and a Porsche. I mean, a Porsche costs more. There's no question.
right.
Right.
And I'm going to echo somewhat what my fellow commissioner, Mr. Addison, was asking when he said, why did you go forward with a design for a Porsche when you only had money for a Prius? It's hard to understand, and I know both you and Ms. Barker keep saying that HPC required it to cost more money. Let me finish. I have a hard time with that. My reading of Historic Preservation Committee minutes indicates to me that what they were asking for was a redesign, and that in nowhere do I see anything that suggests it should be more expensive or would have to be more expensive. So we part company there, and I just want to note that. And then I want to say that I had difficulty when I went through the materials. Ms. Barker, you had sent an email to Mr. Wyrick that he forwarded on to me as chair of the committee here. And in that letter, you mentioned what you said here, that there was an increased materials and time involved now, and that ironwork is time-consuming and costly. But then, in the budget request, the $8,000 is, by the artist, pulled out and listed as being for the side gates. And I found that very confusing, because the side gates were always part of the museum board's initial request for the project. So these are just some things I'm bringing up because they were very confusing. And perhaps we ultimately need clarification. Is the increase for the side gates, as it is listed in the budget proposal, or is it for the additional time, or is it for the additional material? Because
Well,
it's
the-
really hard to track it.
The entire project got more, so the initial gates ended up costing more money. The front gate cost more money, right? And the side gate is an entirely different animal than what was proposed before. So as I had explained earlier, the $20,000 was based on an initial concept of $10,000 per gate. That
More or less expensive than the original.
You can say something. Go ahead. Mr. Addison wants to make a comment. Do you want to?
Parenthetical question, are the side gates as redesigned more, less, or the same cost as the original side gate design?
in reality or on paper?
Well, we're talking about everything on paper at this point, Doug. I don't
Based
understand
on
the
the,
question.
so this budget as outlined on the budget page, the numbers there, that side gate, if you were to buy it separately, would be more than $8,000, okay? So that is just a convenient number relative to the project as a whole.
But you haven't answered my question.
So the initial proposed side gates would cost more than $8,000.
So it would have cost more than the present side?
No, it would have cost more than $8,000. I just said the present side gates would, if you were buying them separately, cost more than $8,000.
And we want to take into account what you said earlier, that your original cost was $10,000 per gate.
gate.
Okay.
Yes. So, you know, these budget numbers are me trying to fit
Confusing.
this.
Go ahead.
Yeah, okay.
These
All right, well,
budget-
let's go on, because I think no matter how we slice this, it's confusing. And that's understandable, because many of us here understand that public art is a liquid process. It's ongoing. There's changes in design, changes in what you're going to do. It's just part
But this isn't,
of all art.
wasn't approached as public art. So, I mean,
Well, at a certain point, we're talking about it as
Right, but
public
when I
art.
do public art, I'm given a budget, a
Yes,
fixed budget.
yes,
right?
and we do
And
recognize
I
that this did
design-
not happen according to
I
Hoyle.
designed to that budget.
But you were told from the beginning, or from the time that the city council approved it, that there was $20,000.
I gave them that budget.
No, the city council, the museum.
Well, they approved
The
20, but-
museum proposed
Right.
$10,000 to the city council, and on Mr. Wyrick's initiative, recognizing that it's essentially public art, he proposed that the council
Double it.
double it and allocate $20,000. And at that point, you knew that the budget was $20,000, correct?
And I designed a set of gates to fit in that number,
Okay.
which weren't approved.
Oh, question.
Marcy.
I don't recall where I read it, but did you provide the HPC with some other designs, sketches or concept designs? I read that somewhere. Only this one
Well,
design.
that one,
Yeah.
I think you're probably thinking about the timeline that notes that back in
presented the
2015, the museum board, Mr. Lochner,
right.
showed them
I
more than
showed
one
them
design.
Oh, right,
numerous-
right.
Yeah, I showed them numerous gates.
Would it-
So the, again, you know, if we're gonna get hooked on budget, the 20,000 thing, then the design that's been approved, we can throw out the window. Because that's
All
not
right, well,
achievable.
I'm going to move along here, because I think, as I said, no matter which way we do this, it's confusing. I do want to make a comment on the additional work that you listed in your joint meeting packet, because those steps I've found to be appropriate and expected for the project. They're not additional work due to a redesign. No matter what the gate design, those steps would need to be taken. And I'm glad to see that those steps are not being listed as a reason for the increase, so we're on the same page there. But I do want to talk about the powder coat, because as I reviewed these materials, it became a little disconcerting. The report by the Historical Research Survey, in both the January HPC packet and in the joint meeting packet, because they were virtually the same, say, and I quote, "Specifications provided by the gate designer state that the front entry gate will be formed of hand-forged steel flat bar, 1/2 inch by 1 inch, finished with the powder coat primer in a top coat of aged bronze patina or patina finish." And on page 12, quote, "The side entry gate will be finished with the powder coat primer and a patinated aged bronze top coat." Now, for me, spreading this out and looking at it, that indicates that the powder coat finish was always included in the project and considered by the HRS report to be an integral part of the approved design. And I will say right here that for that reason, I cannot support suggesting to City Council that they pay an additional $2,000 for the powder coat finish. I believe, or it's my opinion, that the powder coat finish should be applied at no additional cost, as it was expected as part of the approval of the design by the Historic Resource Survey report. I just want to go on record saying that, and that's a side issue, but I think it's important. And then, in spite of all the questions that I've asked here and my fellow commissioners have asked here, I think it's important to say on the record that the museum was acting in good faith as the city agent for this project for well over 2 years. And you may have, in conversation with the artist, and perhaps it was inadvertently, that you indicated additional money for the project would be forthcoming. Now, in a recent July communication, it's attachment F in your packet, Mr. Lochner states his belief that the initial budget, quote, was a target budget, that's in quotes. And he also says, quote, "a recommended starting point for this project." So clearly the artist, in good faith, believed that the $20,000 was just an initial budget. Now, this committee struggles with how Mr. Lochner came to this conclusion. We've asked you about conversations between the museum and the artist that led the artist to believe the $20,000 was not the total budget for this project. The letters sent by the museum board president and the museum director supporting Mr. Lochner's request for additional funds were sent after the joint meeting. In other words, after the artist completed a redesign and after the artist determined the redesign would be more costly. So I've studied, I've pondered, and quite frankly, I've sweated over this because it's an unusual set of circumstances, and I've asked myself whether or not I can justify recommending that the city take responsibility for a steep, almost 50% cost increase that was never proposed to City Council until after the fact. So, are the informal conversations Mr. Lochner had with the museum director and museum board that led him to believe the budget for the project could be more than $20,000 justification for City Council to devote additional capital improvement funds for this project? Now, if the museum agrees that the additional money was promised to Mr. Lochner for this project, then I think it's the museum who must come up with the additional funding. The most logical and equitable outcome, in my mind, is for the museum board to work with Mr. Lochner to address his expectation that they put in place that $20,000 was but a starting budget for this project. So I'm just going to say that City Council, the cost of this project, to ask City Council to up that anywhere from $8,000 to $10,000 is just something that I don't think I could recommend in good faith. I don't think it should fall back on City Council in this case for the reasons that I suggest. And I would ask Mr. Vega, is this a point, if discussion is finished, that we would make a motion?
Yes.
Can I address that prior to a motion?
Prior to the motion, yes, but we can also
Sure.
make the motion.
Okay, so I understand your position. I respectfully say I believe your logic is flawed. So again, if we go back and look at this project and analyze the situation without emotion and look at it in the timeline in which it was placed, the facts are pretty clear. The museum had a need. They came to me and said, how do we fix this? I said, well, you have these options. I think it can be done for this much money. Here, they said, oh, great, let's go try to get that money. Give us some tools to do that. So I came up with a design. We proposed to the city within the guidelines of that budget. That design was rejected. It's not our fault the design was rejected. The design was intentional. It was designed per a particular budget to achieve a particular set of goals. So in my business, we call that a scope of work, okay? The scope of work changed. So when we went in front of, when that initial design was rejected, the scope of work changed. We were given a new set of rules. And the new set of rules, the new scope of work,
Let me respond to that.
necessitated a new design. The new design addressed the scope of work, which made the budget go up. So the easiest way for me to put this to you in a visual sense is, we came to you with a one-story house. You guys said, no, not going to work. We need this. So we came back to you with a two-story house, which got approved. A two-story house costs more to build than a one-story house. That's where we're at. It's not the museum's fault that the project cost went up. It's not my fault the project cost went up. The requirements that were put on the project simply changed. They didn't change because of us. They didn't change because of the needs. They changed because there were things put on this project, restrictions put on this project that weren't there initially. Maybe it's because we didn't know they would be there. They didn't know they'd have to go get a historic resource report.
That had already been gotten for the first proposal, Mr.
No,
Lochner. Yes,
this-
it was. It's in our packet.
The city wouldn't let them go in front of the committee until that. So when we originally started, there was no talk of HPC, none. This was a set of gates. There was no talk of it going in front of anybody other than planning and building and safety, maybe. It wasn't going to be looked
But I
at.
believe you have said several times here that the first design could be done for $20,000, and that first design
Right.
was presented along with the resource survey.
But-
That did not happen after that. It's in the packet.
The
Yeah,
city
because-
forced them to get the resource survey.
I was told to go to HPC first.
Pardon me?
I was told to go to HPC, and one of the requirements for HPC was to get that report done.
Yes, yes, but I'm not addressing that. I'm only addressing that there's a statement been made here today that the first gate design could be done for $20,000. And now we're hearing that the second design required a historic resource, but that had been done for the first design.
Yeah.
I
We
didn't-
And I also, and I'm going to interrupt, because I also want to say that I think, Douglas, that you've misunderstood what I'm saying. What I'm saying here, when I say I can't forward this on, me personally, to city council in good faith, I'm not saying that the second design does or does not require additional funding. What I'm saying is, can I recommend that that funding come from city council? So we're not so off the page on whether or not the second design does or does not cost more, et cetera, et cetera. I'm really not even commenting on that. I've struggled to understand that. I've put that over here, and what I'm saying is, who should be the responsible party for additional funding?
Right.
And what we're saying is that, quite frankly, I think it behooved the museum board to go to city council before a more expensive design was offered and say, in other words, the steps here are out of order. And now city council, we're being asked to recommend to city council that they kind of like take the fall for the money. City council may have said, "No, what do you mean it's going to cost more money? Then we're not going to go this way." Because all in all, $40,000 for museum gates, because you said you're absorbing quite a bit of this cost yourself, which I know you do that regularly, Douglas. And, so I don't think that there's a disagreement here about should you be getting more money.
I'm
It's
not-
should city council be asked to give that money.
I think the question here, again, boils back to the timeline. So when we were initially talking, right, and the initial budget came about, and they floated that with the city and said, hey, can we get this to build some gates? I don't think they realized, and I know I certainly didn't realize or hadn't been made abreast of the fact that it would have the level of scrutiny it had as far as all the approvals and procedures and HPC and, historic and all that stuff. So that was put on after that, okay? After the, like the report you're talking about, the city asked them to get that report prior to looking at the gate proposal. They said, we can't look at it until
Right.
you get somebody to bless it, basically. And by the way, I will point out that the consultants did bless it. They said the
Yes,
original
they did.
design
Yeah.
was appropriate and was very fitting. So had the city's committees taken the recommendation of the consultant that they forced the museum to hire, okay, and approved that gates, they'd be in by now. They'd be done.
For the $20,000.
For the
That's my whole point.
But
Thank you.
But they didn't. The problem is they didn't. They said,
No,
"Great,
but
thank you
what
so
what you were
much for
talking
getting
about
this
here is
report."
whether or not the historical service survey, which did not change from the HPC meeting to the joint meeting. I looked at it. The packet is
same thing.
identical.
We
In
didn't
fact,
go
the
back to-
explanation in the joint meeting didn't change to reflect the new gate design. It still talks about the original gate design.
Because it's
Nothing
the same-
changed. It didn't go back.
It's
Right.
the same report.
Yeah, it's the same.
But it
rules.
specifies, this is my point, that same report specifies the onion design for the gate. So the Historical Resource Survey report was not redone,
Right.
taking into account this new design. There's a question about whether or not it should have been, but it wasn't. So there's no additional work that we can identify that happened as a result of the HPC in the new gate design. We can, I think, all of us, entertain what you have told us about the additional costs for the shaping of the bars for the new design, the shaping of the bars for the side gate, the mechanism that goes into the ground. Instead of it being back, it has been moved to the center, things like that. I pointed out what the changes were between the two. But it has been stated that this is sort of like the fault of the HPC. But the HPC, there's nothing changed from that. And that's just accurate. That can be shown by the materials and by the timeline.
If you look at my proposal on page 11, if you go to item 5,
I think we need to get.
it says, back to
Yeah.
the drawing board, rejected by HPC. Perform additional research to quantify the era, appropriate style, accepted standards, materials, and techniques. Perform additional documentation of the building and highlight specific architectural elements to be used in the design. Create a new concept based on the feedback from HPC and additional research and references. Refine the concepts through a series of sketches. Produce presentation drawings of the new designs, present them to the museum board, and then put together the packet for HPC. That's 100 hours worth of work.
Yes, and we acknowledge that. You obviously had to produce a new design, which required you to do some additional research. We acknowledge that. I think we want to move on, because the charge here is whether or not we can or will recommend, and there's 3 of us, I'm only 1 vote, recommend that City Council dip into the Capital Improvement Fund for an additional $8,000. As I said, the powder coat should be part of this. So I would say that we would consider $8,000, and the powder coat has been designated by the Resource Survey as being part of this. Did you want to say something, Michael, or make a motion?
I want to,
I think we're
I
fine
want to
now
go
with
back to the
discussion.
question of the information that was shared between the museum and the artist, and I want to be sure that I'm correct in my understanding that the museum initially requested $10,000 from the city council for gates, correct?
Yeah, that was before my time, but that is my understanding.
Okay. And that subsequent to that, the city council did allocate $20,000, and that there was clear communication from that point forward that the allocated funds for this project were $20,000. Now, as it became clear that the HPC initiated ideas, or requirements, if you will, were going to lead to an expanded scope of work, the museum still made clear that all they had was $20,000, and the museum board, excuse me, approved the project and sent it forward, the new designs, with the understanding that $20,000 was the amount allocated by the city, correct?
Yes.
Even though the museum at that point, too, must have known that there was,
I did know. It would be
that there
more.
was considerably more work was going to be entailed, and therefore they knew that the cost was going to be higher. But nevertheless, they approved it and sent it forward under the terms of the original allocation. Am I correct in all this?
Yes.
Yes, okay. So then the issue becomes not whether the city should pony up the additional $8,000 or $10,000, but rather how is the museum going to come up with an additional $8,000 to $10,000? And understandably, you first turn to the city, right? The question, I think, in our minds is, is that justifiable, given the fact that in a number of instances, there was an opportunity for the museum to say to the artist, we have $20,000 and that's all. Instead of saying that, you intimated, or perhaps even said, that you'd find the additional money. Am I correct in this? It's what you've said so far today.
I think we had discussions in it, and it was obvious to both sides that what we were being asked to do could not be done for the.
That's not the question. No, that we all agree on. There was an expanded.
But I mean, that's how the other design happened.
No, that is not the issue here. The issue is, was it clear?
I knew that it was
at that
probably
point?
going to come in more. I didn't know how much more.
Okay, but you knew significantly more because he had already said, expanded scope of work, it's going to cost more, we can't do this design for
But it had
$20,000.
no idea, is that a couple
Right.
thousand
Okay.
or 10,000?
So, but you intimated or said, we'll come up with the money, correct?
However, whatever the amount is.
And the board
Well,
approved the design on that
I continually
basis.
said we got 20 grand, and then when we had the budget, we went to the board, and the board approved it after HPC and Kappa had already approved it.
Right, they approved
Because
it.
we hadn't seen
You approved the budget, Mr. Lewis? I thought you said you did not approve the budget,
No,
that you
they-
just
they approved
sent
the
a letter.
design.
They first approved the concept before it went to HPC and Kappa.
Right, so
We
it was.
didn't have the
Approve the
budget
money.
yet. We hadn't seen it.
It was presented to HPC and Kappa with the seal of approval from the board. Yes, we submit this to you, this is the design that we're
Yes, and
behind.
they had not seen the budget at that point.
Be that as it may, they submitted it on the basis of, we've presented this to you, and that was with the full understanding that the allocation was $20,000.
Yes,
Correct?
yes.
Okay. That, to my mind, really clarifies the issue, because the issue, as we've come to understand, is not that there isn't an expanded scope of work for all of the reasons that Doug has elaborated, but that who is responsible at this point? And in my view, it's the museum that's responsible. And I can understand you turning to the city council and asking for additional money, but I think it should be clear that you've known from the time that your board approved this new design that more money was going to have to be raised. And so, in a way, I wouldn't want to make accusations of sandbagging, but it's a strange strategy, I'll
Well,
say
no,
that.
I understand your position.
Thank you. That's all I have to say. And I'd
Well,
like to move.
yes,
I'd like to
please make
move
a
that we
motion.
recommend that the project go forward as planned, and that it is the museum's responsibility to raise the additional funds as necessary.
Do we have a second?
I'll second that.
All right, then we have discussion on the motion, and I would ask Commissioner Addison if he would allow the motion to suggest that we're recommending to the Arts Commission.
Yes, that we're, of course, making this
Right,
recommendation
right,
to the Art
Arts
Commission
Commission.
that would then recommend it to the
Okay.
city
All
council.
right. Would you read the motion back, please, Mr. Vega? You're writing very quickly there. I'll give you a minute or two.
Correct me if I have mistaken, but the motion of the Public Art Committee is to recommend to the Arts Commission that the project go forward as planned, with the museum responsible for the difference.
Correct.
And just to clarify, so the $20,000 has already been approved, and so this
Yes.
is just the difference.
Yes. Any discussion? Ms. Tasher?
Well, I think what this basically is we're in the world of contract law, I think, in the absence of something in writing. So I have to think, was it reasonable for Mr. Lochner to rely on intimations or inferences that he, picked up on from the museum to keep moving forward with his design? And I think he reasonably relied on the activities of the museum and the statements made by the museum and all of that. So that's where I'm at. It's just a matter of a contract in the absence of no contract, really. And I know the museum, the budget is limited and all of that, but this might be a good opportunity for fundraising for the museum to give someone a naming opportunity for those gates, to come up with the shortfall, to get pretty fancy plaque, and they get the recognition, and that might be a way to come up with those additional monies.
Mr. Addison, do you have anything
I have no
further to
additional
say?
comments, no.
Okay. And I would just echo, in particular, what Mr. Addison has said. I really do see it the same way, and you articulated that very clearly, so I think we can move to a vote on the motion.
And can I actually just clarify one thing? So the recommendation would be to the Arts Commission to then recommend to council.
Correct.
So we'll add that as well.
Yes.
Okay, and so one more time, the recommendation would be for the recommendation, or to recommend to the Arts Commission to recommend to council that the project go forward as planned, with the museum being responsible for the difference. And well,
Does it say the 20,000? It should list, it should say the amount.
so as planned with the
For
$20,000.
the budgeted amount of the capital improvement fund budget, please do specify that it's a capital improvement budget amount.
With the current $20,000 capital improvement amount. Okay, so we'll do that. And so if you're ready to vote, Commissioner Tosher,
Yes.
Commissioner Addison,
Yes?
and Chair Golden.
Yes. Okay, now that we've motioned and you know where we are, I have a couple other comments I want to make. And I want the museum and Douglas, you to know that the recommendation of this committee is taken up now at a public meeting by the Arts Commission, and you're more than welcome to come to that meeting and speak to the issue during the public comment session of that meeting, because we're 3 of 7 Arts Commissioners. We will recommend, we will give our reasons why, and then the Arts Commission will take a vote on whether or not to go forward one way or the other on this. So I wanted to say that. I also feel that at this point in time, the Public Art Committee needs to know whether or not, Mr. Lochner, you're willing to sign a contract with the city for $20,000 that includes all of the gate features approved at the joint meeting, and, in my opinion, includes the powder coating. And then you are reliant on additional funding coming from what the museum can do for you. So we need to know, are you willing? We want this to happen. We are in a position to forge a contract for
Right.
$20,000 for you.
There's absolutely no way that I'm willing to sign a commitment to build the gates as were approved in the joint meeting for $20,000.
Okay,
'Cause
thank you.
I'm not willing to lose $20,000
Okay,
to build
thank
those
you.
gates.
We needed to know that, thank
What
you.
if you simultaneously executed a contract with the museum with their guarantee of the additional $8,000? Would that change your answer?
So what we propose to you now, the powder coat is off the table because of maintenance standards and things like that. So actually, the paint finish was decided upon instead of powder coat. So you need to get powder coat off the list. And I think that's a far more intelligent thing anyway, because it makes it easier for the city to maintain the gates in the future. However, that $2,000, we were saying that it would be reasonable to allocate that money in the budget anyway to cover Knox boxes and locks.
I think Ms. Tasher's question has to do with whether or not
So-
you're willing to have a contract with us
Right,
if
so
you
it would be-
have some sort of agreement that the museum will somehow come up with the additional money.
If we can get a contract where I can get $30,000 if they elect for Knox boxes and locks, or $28,000 if they don't elect for Knox boxes or locks.
The only thing that we can do a contract
Yeah.
at this point in time
I understand.
would be for the
So it'd be
$20,000.
2 contracts.
Right.
That's fine with me.
Mr. Lewis, you want to have something to say about that here?
Well, it's just a question. Are you asking that Doug sign a contract now?
No, he would not be, we would have to first wait for the city council meeting
Okay. In other
to
words,
happen.
I'm certainly not in a position, nor is I would project the board in a position to guarantee that money unless we are able to find it. So there's a certain, if there's some time,
Premature.
we can.
James and I talked about this.
So I guess it's a matter of
Find out whether or not we're going to. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, anyway, we might undertake to try to find the money, but we don't know how long it would take, and we can't
Understood.
stand here and
Understood.
guarantee it. So, if there's a certain amount of a delay before such contract must be signed, or Doug has to say yay or nay, that might be
We couldn't
convenient.
forge a contract prior to the city council meeting at which they will take up our recommendation, and they may or may not. They may decide to go against what virtually is a report from the commission and approve the money. We don't know what they're going to do.
But subsequent to that, I think the issue of contracts would come up. Once that is
Okay.
clarified.
Right.
Then the issue of contracts would have to
Right,
So a
so
matter of
that
some
gives you
weeks?
until the end of September.
the end of September.
So, yeah, the next Arts Commission meeting where this would likely be discussed would be September 21st.
Right,
Right.
and then the,
And then it goes to the city council after
right.
that.
Okay,
So it's
so
probably at the first meeting in October
Most likely October 10th.
that's actually the last
About a
meeting in
month and a half.
September.
that the city council will deal
Okay.
with this issue.
Right.
And
Sure.
it's at that point, I think, that the question of contracts will necessarily have to be resolved.
Right.
Okay,
But
so a
our
month,
interest
5
in
weeks.
asking this question is we want to know if the artist is willing to go forward, because if he is not willing to go forward, then we also have some time between now and that September meeting to consider what we might do if you can't come up with the money and he's not willing to move forward for the $20,000. So this question was an informal question to Mr. Lochner to get a feel for what his position is, and he's been very helpful and made it very clear that he will not do it for 20 grand. So that, we've got that. That was
Understood. Thank you.
important to know.
For clarification, and this should go on the record, what I said was I would not do those gates for 20,000. I didn't say I wouldn't do any gates. I said I would not do the gates that were approved at the joint meeting.
Understood.
Correct.
Thank you.
20,000.
Understood. I also want to go on record that if we do move forward with this project, and Mr. Lochner is the artist, that in order to avoid further snafus moving forward, that when approval is needed before beginning or ending specific actions and steps, that it is understood by both the artist and the museum that the approval must come not only from the museum, but also from the city. And in this case, that would be the city's public art arm. So I would ask staff that if indeed we do move forward with Mr. Lochner, that there's a follow-up memo of understanding that the artist and the museum both understand that the city must be included in all approval steps, as Mr. Lochner outlined in his 20-some steps that still need to be completed. Want to be clear on that. And that's it. I think we can adjourn the meeting, and I thank everybody.
Thank you all.